You don't belong here. Get out before I make you regret it." Those words would destroy everything Deputy Wilson thought he knew about power. Sarah Thompson walked up the courthouse steps in her simple black dress, carrying a leather bag with today's important papers. She looked like any other person coming to court. But Deputy Wilson saw something different. He saw someone he thought didn't belong. "Another troublemaker trying to sneak in," Wilson muttered to his partner, Deputy Clark. "Watch this." Wilson stepped right in front of Sarah, blocking her path to the courthouse door. His hand moved to his belt where his handcuffs hung. His face showed pure hate as he looked down at her. "Where do you think you're going?" Wilson demanded, his voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "I'm here for work," Sarah replied calmly, trying to step around him. Wilson grabbed her arm hard. "Work? What kind of work would someone like you have in this courthouse?" Before Sarah could answer, Wilson's open hand flew across her face. The slap was so hard it echoed off the courthouse walls. Sarah's head snapped to the side. Her leather bag fell from her hands, papers flying everywhere in the wind. People stopped and stared, but nobody helped. Some pulled out their phones to record. Others just walked away, not wanting to get involved. Wilson grabbed Sarah by her throat and slammed her against the stone wall of the courthouse. "You people think you can just walk into any building you want. This is a place for real citizens, not for trash like you." He twisted her arms behind her back. Metal handcuffs bit into her wrists. The cold steel felt like ice against her skin. "Please," Sarah said quietly. "Just let me show you my ID." "I don't need to see anything from you," Wilson snarled. "I know exactly what you are." Deputy Clark laughed and kept recording with his phone. "This is going to be good," he said to Wilson. "Make sure you get her for resisting arrest, too." Sarah's face hurt where Wilson had hit her, but her eyes stayed focused on something above the courthouse entrance. There was a bronze sign that read, "The Honorable Judge S. Thompson presiding." The sign was only 20 feet away from where she was being attacked. Wilson dragged Sarah up the courthouse steps, her shoes scraping against the concrete. Court security guards opened the doors but didn't ask any questions. They had seen Wilson do this before. "Another criminal trying to cause trouble," Wilson announced to everyone in the lobby. "Don't worry, I handled it." Inside the courthouse, Wilson straightened his uniform and fixed his tie. He had done this many times before. Tell his story first. Make himself look like the hero, and make sure everyone believed his version of what happened. The temporary judge for today, Judge Martinez, was a thin man in his 50s who always supported the police. Wilson knew this would be easy. "Your Honor," Wilson began, his voice steady and practiced. "I was doing my regular security check when I found this woman trying to break into the courthouse." Wilson pointed at Sarah, who now sat in handcuffs at the table where defendants sit. A purple bruise was growing on her left cheek where he had slapped her. "The defendant was acting very strange, refusing to show ID, and got angry when I asked her to follow basic security rules," Wilson continued. Judge Martinez nodded, already believing every word. "What exactly did you see, Deputy Wilson?" "Well, sir, she was dressed wrong for court, and she was carrying papers that looked stolen. When I tried to investigate, she started cursing at me and making threats." From the back of the courtroom, Deputy Clark nodded along. He had heard Wilson tell similar stories many times before. Different people, same lies. "She kept screaming that she was someone important," Wilson said with a sneer. "These people always claim to be lawyers or judges or whatever they think will get them out of trouble. I've seen it all before, Your Honor." Judge Martinez leaned forward, interested in the story. "Did she try to run away or fight back?" "Absolutely. The defendant got violent when I tried to put her in custody for everyone's safety. I had to use force to protect the public." Wilson's voice was confident, but his hands shook just a little. He was good at lying, but something about this felt different. The court reporter's fingers moved quickly across her keyboard, writing down every lie for the official record. In the back of the courtroom, a young legal assistant frowned. Something about this woman seemed familiar, but she couldn't remember what. "Deputy Clark," the prosecutor called out. "Can you tell us what you saw?" Clark stood up, his uniform perfectly pressed. "Yes, ma'am. I watched the whole thing. The defendant was clearly trying to get around our security. Deputy Wilson handled everything professionally." "And what about the alleged assault?" Judge Martinez asked. Wilson's jaw got tight. "Your Honor, I only used the force I needed to stop someone who was threatening courthouse security. If the defendant got hurt, it's because she fought against lawful commands." He pulled out his phone and showed a video that started in the middle of the fight. "I have some footage here, though my body camera had technical problems this morning." The lie came out of his mouth so smoothly. He had used the same excuse many times before. "How convenient," Sarah said quietly, speaking for the first time. "Excuse me?" Judge Martinez raised an eyebrow. "Nothing, Your Honor," Sarah replied calmly, but her eyes burned with controlled anger. Wilson kept going with his fake story. "What we have here is a classic case of someone playing the victim after getting caught breaking the law. She was trespassing, carrying suspicious documents, and when I caught her, she immediately claimed I was being racist." The prosecutor, a middle-aged woman named Helen Davis, nodded sympathetically. "Deputy Wilson, in your 12 years of service, have you seen this before?" "Unfortunately, yes. There's a pattern here. Some people think they're above the law, that rules don't apply to them. They use false accusations to avoid taking responsibility for their crimes." Wilson's voice got louder with fake anger. "It's insulting to people who really face discrimination." Several people in the courtroom, mostly white courthouse workers, nodded in agreement. They had heard similar stories on the news and social media. It felt familiar and comfortable. "The defendant claims she was coming to work," Wilson made air quotes mockingly, "but she couldn't show any proof of employment, any ID, or any real reason for being in a restricted area." Deputy Clark stepped forward. "If I may add, Your Honor, the defendant was carrying what looked like confidential legal documents. We think she might be involved in identity theft or fraud." Judge Martinez looked very interested. "Fraud?" "Yes, sir." Wilson jumped back in, feeling confident. "These papers had official letterhead, case numbers, and sensitive information. No regular person would have access to stuff like this. We believe she was planning to pretend to be court staff." The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife, but Wilson kept talking, having no idea he was digging his own grave. "In my professional opinion," Wilson concluded, "this is just another case of someone trying to work the system. She knows if she can make this about race and police brutality, she can distract everyone from her real crimes. It's a calculated way to manipulate public sympathy." He turned to face Sarah directly, his eyes cold and full of contempt. "These people think they can just walk into any building, any courtroom, any space they choose. And when they get stopped, they scream discrimination. Well, not in my courthouse." The words hung in the air like poison. Several court staff members shifted uncomfortably, while others remained stone-faced. "Your Honor," Prosecutor Davis added, "the state recommends we proceed with charges of trespassing, resisting arrest, and assault on a police officer. The defendant's attempt to make this a civil rights issue is clearly a desperate defense strategy." Wilson allowed himself a small smile. This was going exactly as planned. Another case, another win, another reminder that the system worked the way it was supposed to. People learned their place, or they learned it the hard way. Furthermore, Wilson continued, feeling bold because of the supportive atmosphere, "I want to emphasize that I showed remarkable restraint. The defendant was clearly unstable, possibly on drugs. A less experienced officer might have used much more force. Judge Martinez nodded seriously. Your professionalism is noted, Deputy Wilson. In the defendant's chair, Sarah sat perfectly. Still, her hands folded despite the handcuffs. Her face remained calm, almost peaceful, but anyone looking closely would have noticed the slight smile at the corners of her mouth. She was taking mental notes of every lie, every made-up detail, every piece of evidence that would soon destroy Wilson's career and reputation. The deputy had no idea he was lying in front of the very person who had the power to end him. Is there anything else you'd like to add, Deputy Wilson? Judge Martinez asked. Wilson straightened his shoulders with pride. Just that incidents like this remind us why we need strong law enforcement. Some people only understand authority when it's backed by force. The defendant learned today that actions have consequences. He had no idea how true those words would prove to be. The prosecutor smiled confidently. The state rests its case against this defendant, Your Honor. The evidence clearly shows a pattern of criminal behavior and resistance to lawful authority. Wilson stepped down from the witness stand. He caught Sarah's eye one final time. He winked at her, a gesture of complete dominance and total victory. It would be the last moment of triumph in his entire career. The defendant may now present her statement, Judge Martinez announced, his tone suggesting this would be just a formality before sentencing. Sarah Thompson rose slowly from her chair, the handcuffs making a soft clinking sound as she moved. Despite the purple bruise on her cheek and her wrinkled clothes, she carried herself with unmistakable dignity that made several people in the courtroom shift uncomfortably. Thank you, Your Honor. Her voice was clear, controlled, and carried an authority that seemed to fill the entire room. Judge Martinez blinked. Something in her tone was unexpected, professional in a way that didn't match the story he'd been told. First, I want to correct several factual errors in Deputy Wilson's testimony, Sarah began, her eyes sweeping the courtroom methodically, landing on each person who had supported the deputy's lies. According to his statement, I was trespassing on government property. However, I was walking on a public sidewalk approaching the main entrance of this courthouse at approximately 8:30 a.m. She turned slightly, addressing Judge Martinez directly. Your Honor, I'm sure you're familiar with the Supreme Court ruling in Hague v. Committee for Industrial Organization, which clearly establishes that public sidewalks next to government buildings are traditional public forums where citizens have a constitutional right to be present. The court reporter's fingers paused mid-stroke. The prosecutor frowned. This wasn't the rambling emotional outburst they expected from someone facing serious charges. Furthermore, Sarah continued, Deputy Wilson testified that I was carrying suspicious documents and suggested I was involved in identity theft. I'd like to examine that claim more closely. She gestured toward the evidence table where her scattered papers had been collected. Those documents are indeed authentic legal materials. Specifically, they include pending case files, judicial, memos, and administrative correspondence, all of which I have legitimate access to in my professional capacity. Professional capacity? Judge Martinez interrupted. And what exactly is your profession, Miss? Sarah paused, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Thompson, Dr. Thompson, and I think we'll get to my professional background shortly, Your Honor. Wilson felt a chill run down his spine. Something was very wrong with this picture. Your Honor, if I may continue, Sarah said, her voice taking on the rhythm of someone completely comfortable in a courtroom setting. Deputy, Wilson also testified that I became verbally aggressive and used profanity. I'd like to address that claim by invoking my Fifth Amendment right to remain silent regarding any statements I may have made during the alleged incident. She paused, letting that sink in. However, I will note that any statements I did make were in direct response to being physically assaulted without provocation, warning, or legal justification. The young legal assistant in the back row sat up straighter, Something about this woman's voice and mannerisms seemed very familiar. Now, regarding the deputy's claim that his body camera malfunctioned, Sarah continued, and now there was steel in her voice. Your Honor, I'm sure you're aware of the federal rules of evidence, particularly Rule 1006, which allows for the introduction of summaries of voluminous records. I have reason to believe that comprehensive video and audio evidence of this morning's incident exists and will be made available to this court. Judge Martinez leaned forward. What kind of evidence are you referring to? Your Honor, this courthouse has extensive security camera coverage, including high-definition cameras positioned at 15-foot intervals along the main approach. Additionally, the county maintains automatic backup systems for all officer body cam footage, regardless of claimed equipment malfunctions. The color drained from Wilson's face. He had forgotten about the courthouse security cameras in his rush to control the story. I would like to formally request, Sarah continued, that this court issue a preservation order for all electronic surveillance data from this morning between 8:15 and 9:15 a.m., including but not limited to courthouse security footage, body cam backup files, and any mobile phone recordings that may have been made by officers present at the scene. Prosecutor Davis stood abruptly. Objection, Your Honor. The defendant cannot simply make evidentiary demands without proper legal representation. Sarah turned to face the prosecutor with a look that made the woman take an involuntary step backward. Your Honor, pro se defendants have the constitutional right to present evidence in their own defense under the Sixth Amendment. Additionally, Brady v. Maryland establishes the prosecution's obligation to preserve potentially exculpatory evidence. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. This was not how these cases usually went. Judge Martinez cleared his throat nervously. Miss Thompson, you seem unusually familiar with legal procedure. Do you have formal legal training? I have. Some experience with the judicial system, Your Honor. Sarah's response was carefully neutral, but her eyes gleamed with something that looked almost like amusement. Sarah walked as much as the handcuffs would allow to the evidence table and gestured toward her scattered belongings. Your Honor, I'd also like to address Deputy Wilson's characterization of my presence here as suspicious or unauthorized. She pointed to a specific document among the papers. This is my daily court calendar, which shows I was scheduled to appear in this building for legitimate business starting at 9 a.m. this morning. The bailiff, a large man named Henderson, who had worked in this courthouse for 15 years, suddenly went very still. He was staring at Sarah with growing recognition and horror. Deputy Wilson testified that I claim to be someone important, Sarah continued. I'd like to clarify that I never made any such claim during our encounter. However, I did attempt to show him my identification, which he refused to examine before initiating his assault. She paused, surveying the courtroom. Your Honor, I have in my possession, despite Deputy Wilson's violent interference, documentation that will conclusively establish both my identity and my legitimate reason for being at this courthouse this morning. Judge Martinez was beginning to look distinctly uncomfortable. What kind of documentation? Sarah reached carefully into her jacket pocket, moving slowly to avoid startling anyone. My judicial parking pass, issued by this courthouse's administrative office, my building access card, programmed with my judicial chamber's entry code, and my official identification. Bailiff Henderson suddenly stood up, his face pale as he recognized the woman he'd seen every day for the past 8 years. Your Honor, Sarah said quietly, I believe there's been a significant misunderstanding about who exactly Deputy Wilson assaulted this morning. She held up a leather credential wallet, and even from across the room, the gold judicial seal was clearly visible. Perhaps we should recess so that proper identifications can be verified, she suggested, her voice carrying the unmistakable tone of someone who was used to giving orders in courtrooms, not taking them. Judge Martinez stared at the credential wallet, then at Sarah's face, then at the bailiff, who was nodding grimly. "Court will recess for 15 minutes, he said, hoarsely. As the gavel fell, Wilson felt his world beginning to crumble around him. Whatever game he thought he was playing, he was beginning to realize he might not understand the rules at all. During the 15-minute recess, the courthouse buzzed with nervous energy. In a small holding room next to the courtroom, Sarah sat, calmly, while Bailiff Henderson fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking as the reality of the situation hit him. "Judge Thompson," he whispered, his voice thick with horror. "Jesus Christ, Judge Thompson. I am so sorry. I didn't recognize you." "In civilian clothes and when they brought you in like that." "It's all right, Henderson," Sarah replied softly. "You weren't part of this, but I need you to do something for me." "Anything, Your Honor. Anything at all. I need you to go to my chambers quietly and bring me my judicial robes, the black ones with the gold trim. And Henderson," she looked him directly in the eye, "bring my gavel too, the engraved one from my swearing-in ceremony." Henderson nodded vigorously and hurried out, leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, centering herself the way she had learned to do during her 20 years on the bench. This morning she had been Judge Sarah Thompson, respected jurist, protector of constitutional rights, guardian of justice. In the span of 30 minutes, she had been transformed into a victim, a defendant, a woman in handcuffs facing trumped-up charges. But now, it was time to reclaim what was hers. Her phone, confiscated during the arrest but now returned, buzzed. With missed calls and messages, her clerk, Janet Morrison, had sent increasingly frantic texts. "Judge Thompson, where are you? The Peterson hearing is in 30 minutes. Your Honor, the attorneys are here asking about delays. Judge Thompson, please call me back. There are rumors something happened." Sarah typed back quickly. "Tell the Peterson attorneys we'll reschedule. Something more important has come up. Clear my afternoon calendar." She scrolled through her contacts until she found the number she was looking for. Chief Judge Patricia Carter, the administrative head of the entire judicial district. "Patricia, it's Sarah." "Sarah, thank God. We heard there was some kind of incident. Are you all right?" "I've been better. Patricia, I need you to do something for me, and I need you to do it without asking questions right now." "Of course. Whatever you need." "I need you to contact the courthouse security office and tell them to immediately preserve and copy all surveillance footage from this morning between 8:15 and 9:15 a.m. All cameras, all angles. And Patricia, make sure there are multiple copies, stored in different locations." There was a pause. "Sarah, what exactly happened this morning?" "A deputy named Wilson just spent an hour testifying under oath about how he heroically subdued a dangerous criminal who was trespassing on courthouse property." Sarah's voice was steady, but there was an edge to it that Chief Judge Carter had never heard before. "The dangerous criminal was me, Patricia, on my way to work. He didn't just arrest me. He assaulted me in front of this courthouse, called me trash and told me I didn't belong here." The silence on the other end stretched for nearly 30 seconds. "Jesus Christ, Sarah, are you—" "What do you need? Should I call the FBI? The Attorney General's office?" "Not yet. Right now, I need those surveillance recordings secured, and I need you to make some phone calls. I want every case Deputy Wilson has testified in over the past. 5 years pulled and reviewed. Every single one. Consider it done. But Sarah, you can't handle this case yourself. There's a conflict of interest and—" "Patricia," Sarah interrupted, "in about 10 minutes, I'm going to walk back into that courtroom wearing my judicial robes. Deputy Wilson is going to learn exactly who he assaulted this morning, and more importantly, who has the power to ensure he faces the consequences of his actions." Henderson returned, carrying a garment bag and a small wooden box. "Your robes, Your Honor, and your gavel." Sarah stood and unzipped the garment bag, revealing the flowing black judicial robes that had been her armor for over 2 decades. As she slipped them on, she felt the transformation begin. The fabric settled on her shoulders like a mantle of authority. Each fold was a reminder of the power she wielded, the oaths she had taken, the justice she was sworn to protect. She opened the wooden box and lifted out her ceremonial gavel, its weight familiar and comforting in her hand. Engraved on its handle were the words, "Justice is blind, but she sees all." "Henderson," she said, adjusting her robes, "when we return to that, courtroom, I want you to announce me properly." "Yes, Your Honor. How would you like to be announced?" Sarah Thompson straightened to her full height, every inch the federal judge she had been for the past 20 years. The Honorable Judge Sarah Thompson presiding. She looked at herself in the small mirror on the wall. The bruise on her cheek was still visible, but now it served a different purpose. It wasn't just evidence of Wilson's brutality. It was a symbol of how far the system had fallen and how completely it was about to be restored. When court resumes, Deputy Wilson will learn what justice really means. "All rise!" Henderson's voice boomed through the courtroom with an authority that made everyone snap to attention. But what happened next would be burned into their memories forever. Court is now in session. The Honorable Judge Sarah Thompson presiding. The words hit the courtroom like a thunderbolt. Deputy Wilson, who had been leaning casually against the prosecutor's table, went rigid. Judge Martinez, still seated in what he now realized was not his chair, turned pale as death. The prosecutor's mouth fell open in shock. Sarah Thompson entered. Through the judge's chamber door, wearing her full judicial robes, the gold trim catching the overhead lights. She moved with the measured pace of someone who had walked this path thousands of times before. In her right hand, she carried her ceremonial gavel. The silence was absolute. Not a single person dared to breathe. She took her place behind the bench, her bench, and sat down slowly, deliberately. Her eyes swept the courtroom, taking in every shocked face, every dropped jaw, every person who was finally beginning to understand the magnitude of what had just happened. "Deputy Wilson," she said quietly, her voice carrying the full weight of judicial authority, "you may remain standing." Wilson looked like he was about to vomit. His face had gone from red to white to green in the span of 30 seconds. "Your Honor," Judge Martinez stammered, rising from his chair. We didn't, I mean to say—" "Judge Martinez," Sarah interrupted, her tone crisp but not unkind. "Thank you for managing my courtroom during my unexpected delay. You may return to your own docket. I'll handle this matter from here." Martinez practically ran from the courtroom, his robes billowing behind him like he was being chased by demons. Sarah turned her attention back to Wilson, who was now visibly shaking. "Deputy Wilson, approximately 2 hours ago, you testified under oath in this courtroom. Do you recall your testimony?" Wilson couldn't form words. "Let me refresh your memory," Sarah continued. "You stated, and I quote, 'These people always claim to be lawyers or judges or whatever they think will get them out of trouble.' Do you remember saying that?" Wilson nodded weakly. "You also stated that I was, quote, 'another troublemaker looking for sympathy and that you had seen it all before.' Is that accurate?" The courtroom was so quiet that the hum of the air conditioning sounded like a roar. "And perhaps most memorably," Sarah's voice grew colder, "you stated that people like me need to learn that, quote, 'actions have consequences.' Do you recall that particular piece of wisdom?" Wilson's legs were shaking so hard he could barely stand. Sarah reached under her bench and pulled out a tablet computer. "Deputy Wilson, I'd like to show you some evidence that has just come to my attention." She turned the tablet screen toward the courtroom. On it was crystal-clear security camera footage from the courthouse steps showing the entire morning's incident from multiple angles. This is footage from courthouse security camera number 7, which has an unobstructed view of the main entrance. Her finger touched the screen, starting the video. The courtroom watched in horror as the events unfolded on screen. There was Sarah, walking calmly toward the courthouse in her civilian clothes. There was Wilson, blocking her path. Another troublemaker. Trying to sneak in, Wilson's voice, clear as day, filled the courtroom through the tablet speakers. Several people gasped audibly. The video continued, showing Wilson's unprovoked assault in vivid detail. The slap that snapped Sarah's head sideways, the brutal grab to her throat, the handcuffs. But the most damning moment was yet to come. People think you can just walk into any building you want. This is a place for real citizens, not for trash like you. Wilson's own words, spoken with such venom and hatred, echoed through his courtroom. Several people in the gallery stood up and walked out in disgust. "Deputy Wilson," Sarah said, pausing. "The video. Do you see any verbal aggression from the defendant in this footage? Any profanity? Any threats?" Wilson remained silent, his career disintegrating before his eyes. "Now," Sarah continued, "let's examine your claim that your body camera malfunctioned." She swiped to a new video file. "This is backup footage from your own body camera, automatically. Uploaded to the county's cloud storage system every 60 seconds, a system you apparently forgot existed." The new video began playing, and Wilson's voice filled the courtroom again, but this time it was even worse. This was the complete, unedited version. "Look at this one, thinking she can just walk into my courthouse. These people need to learn. Their place. Time to teach another lesson." Wilson's voice snarled through the speakers. The prosecutor was frantically gathering her papers, trying to distance herself from the catastrophe unfolding before her. But Sarah wasn't finished. "Deputy Clark," she called out, "you testified under oath that Deputy Wilson handled the situation with remarkable professionalism. Would you like to revise that statement?" Clark was already edging toward the exit, but he couldn't escape what came next. "And here," Sarah said, advancing the video to show Wilson's assault from his own body camera perspective, "we can see the moment when Deputy Wilson committed felony assault against a federal judge." She let those words hang in the air for a moment. Federal judge. Wilson's knees buckled. He grabbed onto the prosecutor's table to keep from falling. "But wait," Sarah said, her voice taking on an almost conversational tone. "There's more." She pulled up a new file on her tablet. "This is audio from Deputy Clark's body camera, which was apparently functioning perfectly this morning." A new voice filled the courtroom. Clark's voice, speaking to another deputy while Wilson was assaulting Sarah. "Dude's really going off on this one. Think she's actually somebody important like she keeps saying?" Another deputy's voice responded. "Nah, man. Look at her. Wilson knows what he's doing. Probably just another welfare case trying to work the system." Laughter from the officers as they watched their colleague brutalize a federal judge. The few remaining spectators in the gallery were staring at Wilson with undisguised revulsion. "Deputy Wilson," Sarah said, setting down her tablet, "you asked me earlier if I had any employment verification. Well, I do." She gestured to the judicial seal mounted on the wall behind her bench, then to her nameplate, then to the oil painting of her that hung in the courthouse lobby. "I've been the presiding judge of this courthouse for 20 years. Deputy Wilson, every case you've ever testified in, every warrant you've ever requested, every search you've ever conducted in this jurisdiction has been under my authority." Wilson finally found his voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "Your Honor, I didn't know." "You didn't know," Sarah repeated slowly. "You didn't know because you didn't bother to look. You saw a black woman and you made assumptions. You saw someone you thought was powerless, and you decided to abuse that power." She leaned forward slightly. But Deputy Wilson, there's something else you didn't know. The courtroom held its breath. For the past 6 months, I've been conducting an investigation into patterns of misconduct and racial bias in this sheriff's department, working directly with the FBI's Civil Rights Division. Wilson's face went completely white. This morning's incident wasn't random, Deputy Wilson. You've been under investigation, and you just provided us with the most perfect evidence we could have hoped for. She lifted her gavel and held it in front of her. Deputy Wilson, you said actions have consequences. You were right about that. Sarah's voice filled every corner of the courtroom with quiet authority. Deputy Wilson, based on the evidence presented in this courtroom, evidence that came from your own mouth, your own actions, your own camera, I find you guilty of assault in the first degree, a felony. The words hit the courtroom like thunder. I find you guilty of assault on a judicial officer, a federal felony carrying a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 years. Wilson's attorney closed his eyes and put his head in his hands. I find you guilty of deprivation of civil rights under color of law, a federal felony punishable by up to 15 years in prison. With each pronouncement, Wilson seemed to shrink further into his chair. And I find you guilty of perjury in the first degree for your false testimony given under oath in this very courtroom. Sarah paused, letting the weight of those charges settle over the room. Court will recess while I consider the appropriate sentence. The gavel came down with a sound like thunder. Wilson collapsed into a chair, his career, his reputation, and quite possibly his freedom now hanging by a thread. Deputy. Wilson, Sarah concluded, you told me this morning to know my place. Well, let me tell you what my place is. My place is on this bench, in this courtroom, ensuring that justice is served. My place is holding people like you accountable when you abuse the power we've entrusted to you. The gavel came down once more. My place, Deputy Wilson, is making sure that what you did to me this morning is the last act of racial violence you will ever commit as a law enforcement officer. Will a